The B in Intel's new Arc B580 graphics card stands for Battlemage, the name of their latest generation GPU architecture. However, from the perspective of the average consumer, it might as well stand for buffer. With 12GB of VRAM as standard, the B580 offers a bigger frame buffer than either of its more established competitors in this price range, and in this day and age, there are definitely worse things for Intel to pin their hopes upon. But is that all it has going for it? This video was brought to you by AliExpress and their Team Up cashback promotion. Join the Iceberg tech team before shopping, and the money you spend on AliExpress.com will help to increase the team's score. The higher we score as a team, the more store credit you'll receive back afterwards, from a minimum of 2% cashback all the way up to 10%. The more you buy, the more you save.
The more you buy, the more you save.
Check out the link in the description and scan the QR code on screen now to join the team. Allegedly, the Battlemage B580 should start at an asking price of just £249 for a reference model. Alas, due to pre-orders exceeding availability, prices can be a bit steeper than that, even on basic models like the ASRock Challenger OC version I have here. Equipped with 12GB of GDDR6 VRAM operating at 19.2 gigabits per second, 2560 shaders, 160 TMUs, 80 ROPs, 160 tensor cores, and 20 RT cores, this is the highest end Battlemage announced so far, with the slightly cheaper B570 coming later this month, offering a cut-down GPU and just 10GB of the same RAM on a narrower bus. From a marketing standpoint, these model numbers are remarkably close to the phenomenally successful Radeon RX 570 and 580, and I'm sure that's no coincidence. For most of the last decade, those old Polaris GPUs have dominated low to mid-price gaming PCs, and if Intel wants to use that as a mission statement for Battlemage, I'm all for it, so long as it has the performance to back it up. As with the previous generation, Battlemage offers Intel's XeSS upscaling. Like FSR, this is a universally compatible upscaler, so it can be used on both Nvidia and AMD GPUs as well. However, using it with an Arc GPU unlocks its full XMX feature set, making XeSS on Arc much more analogous to Nvidia's DLSS, with motion vector calculation to improve image quality and reduce artifacts. Because Intel's marketing department are just as clueless as everyone else is, they've recently rebranded the XeS upscaling modes so they don't match DLSS or FSR anymore. So, for example, quality DLSS and FSR use a 1.5x factor, while the same amount of upscaling in XeSS is now branded as ultra quality. I won't be using XeSS or FSR for benchmarks, except when I'm using ray tracing, where it's usually a necessity to get decent frame rates. But when I do, I'll be matching scaling factors across DLSS, FSR, and XeSS, regardless of what their name is. My standard operating procedure for testing older and lower spec graphics cards is with a test rig I call the moderately priced gaming PC, using a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32GB of tuned DDR5 rather than the high-end Ryzen X3D and Intel i9 chips you might be used to seeing. That's gonna change soon, but for now there are two caveats to bear in mind about my benchmarks. I'm using a PCIe Gen 4 motherboard on a chipset that supports resizable bar. Rebar is practically a necessity with Intel GPUs, so if you're even considering getting a B580, you should first look up whether your motherboard supports rebar, aka Smart Access Memory, or if it can be updated or modified to support rebar. If it doesn't, then you should either consider a platform upgrade, or simply stick to a Radeon or GeForce GPU. Additionally, the B580 is only wired for 8 lanes of PCI Express, so anyone with a platform that doesn't support PCIe Gen 4 or above should expect lower performance than this. For comparison, I've also run benchmarks from a couple of GPUs that are currently available for a similar price: the 10GB AMD RX 6750 GRE, the 8GB GeForce RTX 4060, and the 16GB Arc Alchemist A770. Yes, the GRE is a weird choice, I know, but I don't have an RX 6600 or 7600 class card right now, and this can be picked up on AliExpress for about the same price as the B580. Plus, it splits the difference in terms of VRAM. All three cards run on 8-pin connectors, though some models of 4060 will use an adapter for the universally adored 12-pin connector, and the A770 uses two 8-pins. Despite this, however, the B580 has a TDP of 190 watts, compared to 225 for the older Intel, 170 for the AMD, and 115 for the Nvidia. Some higher-end board partner cards actually have a second 8-pin, so it's reasonable to assume those cards will have a little more headroom for higher clock speeds, while models like this Challenger OC probably don't have much room for further overclocking. As for drivers, in the less than 2-week period between my A770 and B580 tests, Intel have updated drivers twice, from 6325 to 6332 to 6449. As I've been enjoying a bit of flu I picked up over Christmas, I didn't really feel like retesting the A770 again, so only the B580 was tested with these latest drivers. Starting with a slightly older game, Spider-Man Remastered performance looks great at 1440p very high, but I didn't go any further than this, like testing RT or different resolutions, because I'm not actually benchmarking. I'm looking for one specific problem that ruins this game for Arc GPUs. Higher resolution textures and higher detail meshes stream in as you swing from building to building, and when the GPU can't keep up with the speed of your character, the game sometimes has to pause to load everything in. This doesn't actually hurt frame times, so the 1% lows are unaffected, but the effect on gameplay is essentially the same as if the game were having massive stutters. I've only ever seen this happen in the past when testing older CPUs, SLI GPU setups, as well as every single Arc GPU I've ever tested, including this one. I know you don't spend the whole game swinging, this isn't Baldur's Gate 3, but I could still see this being a problem in the long run. Pretty much everyone hates Unreal Engine 5, which is a shame because developers seem to love it. Moreover, gamers and reviewers alike seem to enjoy Black Myth Wukong, a game that was unfortunately made using that reviled engine. Arc GPUs in general don't seem to perform well in this one, though at least at 1080p the B580 enjoys a 20% boost over the older Alchemist flagship. When compared to the AMD and Nvidia cards, however, it's not so simple. The 45 FPS average at 1080p is almost 10% behind the RTX 4060, and a couple of frames under the GRE. At 1440p, however, it only falls off to 36 FPS, whereas the competitors take a much bigger nosedive, leaving the B580 to take second place behind the 4060. The full RT mode enables path tracing, but the lowest setting disables RT reflections, which means that water can end up looking less realistic than the regular lumen mode, so I tend to think of medium as the minimum recommended setting. Naturally, path tracing is still incredibly demanding, so I also enabled 50% upscaling using XCSS to keep as much quality as possible, and at 1080p the B580 still seems pretty playable, and certainly fares better than the Radeon. Also worth mentioning is power consumption. BMW is the title I've used for comparing power drawn from the wall, and both the B580 and Radeon GRE are consuming about 235 watts, whereas the A770 was a good 55 watts higher. None of them quite match the efficiency of the RTX 4060, but if you're determined not to buy GeForce, then this is actually a pretty good showing from Intel, especially considering how hungry their previous generation was. Unfortunately, Alan Wake 2 can only realistically be expected to run at the medium preset on this tier of GPU, and the B580 doesn't really do anything to change that. At 1080p without ray tracing or any kind of upscaling, it is remarkably close to the RTX 4060 and holds a respectable lead over its predecessor. At 1440p it's still holding on and can just about manage a 30fps experience, which is more than can be said for the GRE. With medium ray tracing and some balanced FSR to offset the performance loss, the B580 is still kind of workable at 1080p, with both it and the GeForce card being broadly playable. whereas the Radeon and the old Alchemist card fall short of the mark. At 1440p, the B580 is still technically in second place, but realistically nobody wins in this scenario. The one consistent problem I've seen with the B580 across several games is frame pacing. At 1080p high in God of War Ragnarok, the 60fps average is 15% higher than the A770 and a couple of points higher than the GRE. But the 1% lows are worse than the Radeon and about on par with the older Alchemist card. The pattern is repeated at 1440p, and even though the 8GB RTX 4060 is naturally disadvantaged in the VRAM area, it wins in both averages and 1% lows. The same holds true in Horizon Forbidden West, or at least it does at 1080p. The average is around the 60 mark, about the same as the 6750 GRE, and a good margin ahead of the A770, but the 1% lows are in the mid-40s, which drags the overall experience down. At 1440p, however, all of the cards with smaller VRAM buffers are kneecapped, meaning the B580 actually takes the lead. Only by a frame and a half, mind, but a win's a win. And it's not the only win for the Battlemage either. Ratchet and Clank is a game that cries out for a decent sized frame buffer, hence why the RTX 4060 performs so terribly here. But the B580 comes into its own, averaging almost 90 FPS at 1080p. Stepping up to 1440p also proves too much for the GRE, causing it to lose most of the advantage it had over the GeForce, while the Intel cards are still looking healthy. Enabling RT along with some balanced upscaling really hurts the Radeon. In fairness, if I only stuck to RT reflections, the GRE would probably do just fine, but with high reflections, shadows and ambient occlusion, it just can't keep up. The B580, however, holds onto its lead over the GeForce at 1080p, and even stepping up to 1440p, it can still retain over 60 FPS on average. So far it's been hard to find a mainstream GPU that can handle Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p high, at least until now. I think the Arc devs must have been told to focus on this one, probably because of how many benchmarking channels still use it for testing graphics cards, and the result is an average of nearly 100 FPS at 1080p high, and, as I hinted already, it still retains a 66 FPS average at 1440p. The RT Ultra mode requires some XeSS upscaling, specifically the Ultra Quality setting, which, as I mentioned before, is equivalent to everyone else's Quality mode, and that can't quite manage 60 at either resolution. XeSS doesn't look bad, especially at 1440p, but I'd still be inclined to skip RT at this price point. I was deeply unimpressed by the A770 last week in The Last of Us, and hoped the B580 would make amends for that dismal performance. It does, to an extent. The average at 1080p passes 60 FPS, and while frame times can spike frequently enough to be annoying, it's way better than the older model. However, we're still talking about a different league when compared to the AMD and Nvidia cards. At 1440p, none of the tested cards perform well, and would benefit from some lower settings or upscaling. On the upside, the B580 pulls level with the 4060 due to the latter card's lack of memory. RE4 Remake is another significant win for the B580. The max preset needs a few tweaks to be playable on mid-range GPUs. Each tested card is using a different texture quality setting to keep within the VRAM safe zone, and while the RT reflections are fairly lightweight, lower-end graphics cards like these can get enough of a performance boost from dropping RT that it's worth turning them off. And let's be honest, you probably won't even notice in this one. At 1080p, the B580 holds a 10-frame average over the competition, and while the margin shrinks at 1440p, it's still clinging on to a solid lead over the 4060 and the GRE. The A770, meanwhile, is surprisingly close. Half of the problems I have benchmarking Star Wars Outlaws relate to its quirks. Its high VRAM consumption is offset by high scalability, however that often causes problems with assets not loading or performance being affected on lower VRAM cards. The B580 has its own quirk. It just can't do 1440p medium. 1080p medium's fine, in fact it's on par with the Nvidia card and beats both the GRE and the A770. But I tried 3 separate runs at 1440p and it crashed at roughly the same point each time. Maybe a bug, maybe Intel's subtle way of telling you not to buy Ubisoft games. Who can tell? Once again, the B580's performance in Starfield is weirdly uneven. It can manage a modest 45 FPS average at 1080p, on par with the GRE and about 20% behind the 4060. No great surprise there, but the 1% lows indicate a much more stuttery experience. The ratio of averages to lows is much greater than the other GPUs, which is not a good thing. Moving up to 1440p only makes things worse, with the 1% lows being almost half the average FPS. You may have noticed one title's been conspicuously absent so far. Indiana Jones and the Circle of Doom has been making headlines as the first AAA game to require a graphics card capable of hardware ray tracing, and is also notable for using a lot of VRAM, so the B580 is potentially the ideal choice for this game. However, I was aware that Daniel Owen had found this game has a weird bug on the B580, whereby it only achieves full GPU utilization in rare moments when facing certain directions, and despite there having been 2 driver updates since then, the problem persists. It doesn't seem to affect the whole game, as many indoor sections are performing extremely well, but for now, I don't have any good comparative data from this one. Stalker 2 took a while to benchmark as it refused to fully cache the shaders, and I didn't want to test without them. Thankfully the issue eventually resolved itself, and at 1080p high I saw a 47 FPS average, about 35% improved over the A770, on par with the Radeon, but still some way behind the GeForce. At 1440p the margins close up, and the B580 is only a couple of frames below the 4060 on average, and somewhat ahead in terms of 1% lows. As I've explained before, Counter-Strike 2 doesn't feature very often in my graphics card reviews because the game's more CPU bound than most, and competitive players won't use the high preset anyway, so a fancy pants GPU isn't really required. However, Alchemist had problems with DX11 titles due to running them in an emulation layer, and even though that was apparently changed at some point, I did find the A770 didn't achieve full GPU utilization, even while churning out 20% fewer frames than the Nvidia and AMD cards. Battlemage seems to have a hold on the whole utilization problem, but it still has lower 1% than I'd like. The B580 can average over 170 FPS at 1440 high, but it should be even higher than this. The percentile lows of 65 are dragging the average down, as well as just making the game a less pleasant experience. I'm not going to do the meme. Crysis is a 2007 game, and if you were ever going to play the original version of it, you probably would have by now. There's a remaster with a nice RTGI system that's probably a better fit for modern systems anyway. However, out of curiosity, I gave the original version a go, and found it actually performed pretty well. At very high quality, the game's CPU limited at both 1080p and 1440p, so your mileage will probably vary, but I saw over 130 FPS on average. Far Cry 3 meanwhile is more of the same, reaching similar frame rates as seen in Crysis. We're CPU limited again, so stepping up from 1080p to 1440p doesn't affect the frame rate at all. GTA 5 doesn't really need covering again. The Alchemist series used to have issues with it, like with other DX11 titles, but there's no problem here. At 1440p very high, with some of the advanced settings turned on, we're well over 100 FPS, with 1% lows in the high 60s. Another one I ran out of pure curiosity, Quake 2 RTX is absolutely unplayable at native 1080p with everything turned on. Well, okay, I sort of managed to work my way through base 1, though more by luck than judgment. Seriously, this game's not easy to play at 15 FPS, as anyone who tried to play in software mode back in 1998 can probably attest to. The RTX version doesn't have XeSS support, and the only universal upscaler is FSR1, which looks like piss and still only manages 30 FPS at 65%. So you're probably better off skipping the RT altogether and just playing at 900 FPS. Before I come to any kind of conclusion, there's something I need to address. Around the time I was writing this script, videos from Hardware Canucks and Hardware Aussies came out talking about how the B580 has issues with older CPUs. As far as I know, this isn't new information relating to Arc. I seem to remember my friends at Hardware Lab. Dear God, will you guys just, draw straws? Anyway, I seem to recall Hardware Lab talking about how high the driver overhead was on the A770 a couple of years ago, and I guess that still holds true for Battlemage. That, combined with the need for rebar and now Gen 4 PCI Express, pretty much writes off this GPU for pairing with older, cheaper CPUs. You probably shouldn't stick one of these in an old Optiplex, is what I'm saying. However, I did wonder, is my Ryzen 5 7500F good enough? I mean, despite what some people say in my comments, I know it's more than sufficient for benchmarking most low to mid-range GPUs, even higher-end ones at high resolutions and quality settings, but the B580 could potentially be an exception. Well, it just so happens I bought a Ryzen 7 7800X3D from CEX a few months ago with the idea that I'd be introducing it as my new test platform in 2025. That video's still a week or two away, but I thought, why not power it up and see how it does? FYI, the new test rig is using a B650EI motherboard, which I'm using for its Gen 5 PCIe slot, and 32GB of Crucial Pro overclocking RAM, which I haven't got round to tuning yet, so the timings aren't quite optimal. Also, as I've been sick, I just went back and retested the titles I thought should have done better. Firstly, no, the Spider-Man streaming issue still isn't fixed, so I'm gonna go ahead and say it's not the CPU's fault. Secondly, no, swapping the CPU doesn't resolve the issue in Indiana Jones either. Thirdly, yes, Star Wars Outlaws still crashes at 1440p as soon as I go outside, so that's not related to the CPU either. Performance in God of War Ragnarok is almost exactly the same, and any variations in numbers are within margin of error. The Last of Us sees a really healthy improvement in 1% loads, so I guess pairing this GPU that cost me 280 quid with a CPU that cost over 300 is totally worth it. Starfield got worse. I know this game isn't a fan of AMD CPUs, so perhaps an Intel chip might get slightly more out of it, but the only thing I can think of is that maybe it's sensitive to memory timings. The CS2 also doesn't really change at all, which is very surprising. Yes, it should be GPU limited at these settings, but I'd have hoped that the Ryzen 7 would have helped improve the 1%, and that didn't happen. I could have gone further, but I left it at that. I'm satisfied that the 7500F isn't a major bottleneck for the B580. That being said, it is an uncommonly good budget chip, better than the 12th Gen i5. I shudder to think how an old 5000 series or 3000 series or an Intel 11th Gen or older would fare. Okay, so I think I'm going to throw a bucket of cold water on some of the B580 hype. It's a pretty good graphics card. In fact, just looking at what you get for your money, it seems great. It has more VRAM than its immediate competitors, it has advanced XeSS upscaling in games which support it, and that's apparently going to expand into frame generation in the near future too. It can ray trace better than the nearest AMD cards, and while it's less efficient than the GeForce, power consumption is nowhere near as scary as some people seem to think. Also, because someone out there will be outraged if I don't mention it, Intel Arc GPUs can encode and decode AV1, which the 4060 can also do, but the RX 6000 and RTX 30 series can't. There are still downsides, and there are more of them than you'd like to see in a second generation product. Maybe these are fixable issues, like the problem with Indiana Jones is probably just waiting for a driver update. But we are well past the point where we should be forgiving Intel for not keeping up with new game releases. They've done a remarkable job getting Arc to work with 2 decades plus worth of games in the last 3 years, and we should applaud them for their diligence. But now they need to get better at supporting new releases. Finally, I have to amend my previous statement. Looking at what you get for your money, the B580 seems great for, like, 2023. It's 2025 now, and we're awaiting new releases from both of Intel's competitors, so I'm less inclined to recommend throwing $250 at a B580 right now. Or more realistically, $300 once you've actually found one. No, I can't imagine Nvidia or even AMD having a 12GB GPU at this price point anytime soon, but I can imagine Blackwell and RDNA 4 offering better performance than this. As an influence on the market, something to cause AMD and Nvidia to rethink their pricing strategies for the next generation, we can all be very thankful that the B580 exists. But I might think twice before I actually recommend you buy one. Thanks to AliExpress for sponsoring the video. Join my team at the link below to start earning cash back. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time. And I'm gonna go rest my voice now.